Tonight, we unravel a truth so unsettling that the Vatican did not just hide it, they rewrote the world to bury it. A story stretching back thousands of years to a time when the beings we fear today as demons were worshipped as gods of the earth, the sky, and the night. Their temples filled cities, their symbols shaped empires, their names carried the power of storms and seasons. But when Christianity rose to power, it faced a problem too great to conquer by sword alone. These gods were everywhere, and erasing them meant erasing the memory of humanity itself. So the Church chose the quieter weapon. It rewrote them. What followed was one of the greatest transformations in history. Horned gods of the forest became enemies of heaven. Goddesses of the moon became queens of the underworld. Spirits that once protected families were turned into creatures of fear. Bit by bit, the Vatican constructed an entirely new demonology, painting the old world in shadows while claiming to save the new one from darkness. And as centuries passed, the truth was sealed behind forbidden manuscripts, locked vaults, and sermons whispered through fear. Tonight we open that vault. We follow the trail of shattered statues, forgotten codices, and symbols carved into the stones of temples the Church tried to erase. We uncover how ordinary pagans saw gods, while the Vatican saw threats. And we ask the question no one dares to speak. What if the demons we fear today were never demons at all? What if we are living inside a story crafted to bury an older truth? A truth waiting to rise again? So before we go any deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. What you are about to learn was never meant to be heard. In the beginning there was no devil, no horned monster lurking in the shadows, no fallen angels whispering temptations into the ears of humanity. Before Christianity rose to power, the world was filled with gods who walked beside people, gods who brought the rains, shaped the seasons, guarded the forests, and guided the dead. They were not creatures of darkness. They were life itself. And yet somehow these beings would one day be twisted into demons, feared, hated, erased from memory. The question that should chill anyone who studies history is this: how does a god become a monster? Long before the Vatican existed, long before the word demon was even spoken, the ancient world was alive with divine presence. Every mountain had a guardian spirit. Every river had a keeper. Every storm carried the footsteps of a god. Civilizations from Greece to Egypt, from Babylon to the Celtic kingdoms, believed the universe was crowded with powers far older and wiser than humanity. People feared them, yes, but they also loved them, respected them, and depended on them. There was no sense that these beings were evil. They simply existed like the wind or the sea. Some helped, some hindered, but all were part of the great design. Imagine walking through a forest in those ancient days. You would not feel alone. You would feel watched, protected, maybe tested. To the people living thousands of years before the birth of Christ, the world was not a battlefield between good and evil. It was a tapestry of forces balancing one another, shaping destiny through cycles of destruction and renewal. If a harvest failed, they blamed the anger of a god, not a demon. If lightning struck a temple, they believed a divine message had been sent, not the attack of a fallen spirit. Their worldview was complex, but it was not built on fear. It was built on relationship. This is the part of history that often gets buried. We grow up thinking ancient people worshipped idols because they were ignorant, but in truth they simply saw the world differently. They looked at nature and felt a presence in every corner of it. They believed humanity was not alone but surrounded by countless unseen companions. These gods did not hide in darkness. They were honored in temples, celebrated in festivals, carved into stone and painted on walls. Their stories were sung for generations, until one day a new power rose that wished to replace them. That new power was Christianity. And as it expanded across Europe, it faced an enormous problem. How do you convert millions of people who already have gods who are older than your religion? You cannot erase their gods because they are woven into their identity. You cannot simply tell them these gods never existed because they have seen signs and miracles tied to their ancient faiths. So the easiest solution is to change the meaning of those gods. Take beings once worshipped and transform them into something terrifying, something forbidden, something that must be cast out. This is how the rewriting begins. A god of the forest becomes a demon of the woods. A goddess of childbirth becomes a dark spirit tempting women. A protector spirit becomes a trickster from hell. None of this happened overnight, and it did not happen by accident. It was part of a much larger story, a reshaping of belief that would last centuries. And once the transformation was complete, the world would forever change. The old gods would not be forgotten, they would simply be renamed, from divine to demonic, from sacred to sinful. And in that shift lies one of the greatest untold stories of human history. Christianity did not begin as an empire. It began as a whisper in the eastern corner of the Roman world, a small movement of believers with no power, no armies, and no influence. For its first few centuries, it was a faith preached in hidden rooms and quiet gatherings, a message carried by wanderers and storytellers. But as time passed, something extraordinary happened. The whisper grew louder. The movement spread, and by the time the 4th century unfolded, Christianity stood on the edge of becoming the most powerful force in Europe. Yet with that rise came a challenge unlike anything the early church had ever faced. When Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity in the early 4th century, everything changed. Suddenly, the faith of fishermen and poor villagers was welcomed inside the marble halls of Rome. Churches replaced temples. Bishops replaced pagan priests. And the teachings of Christ moved from the shadows into the heart of political power. But this transformation created a problem that would shape the next 1,000 years. Rome was enormous, and its people had worshipped their own gods for thousands of years. Jupiter, Mars, Diana, Apollo, these were not just names. They were woven into daily life, into agriculture, into war, into community identity. If Christianity was going to rise, then all these older gods had to fall. This was not a simple task. Imagine telling entire nations that the gods they prayed to since birth were suddenly false. Imagine trying to erase centuries of tradition with a single sermon. People do not let go of their beliefs easily. The church knew this. It understood that conversion was not just about belief. It was about power and psychology and rewriting the very meaning of the divine. So instead of trying to destroy the old gods quickly, the church turned to a slower method, one that would take generations, one that would work from the inside out. The first step was to present Christianity as the new center of truth and order, a faith not limited to one region, but destined for all humanity. Bishops and theologians portrayed the old beliefs as chaotic, while presenting Christ as the anchor that could save the crumbling empire. This strategy worked because by the 5th century Rome was collapsing and people were desperate for stability. Christianity offered certainty and structure. It offered rules, comfort, community, and most importantly, a single all-powerful God who promised protection. But there was still a problem. The people converted, but their stories did not disappear. They still whispered the names of their ancient gods in private. They still visited sacred groves. They still believed the spirits of their ancestors walked with them. Deep down, they did not think their gods were evil. They thought the world was full of many forces, and Christianity was just one more. To fully replace the old world, the church needed more than preaching. It needed a narrative that turned the pagan gods into something people would fear. It needed a reason for people to turn their backs on the deities they once loved. This is where demonology enters the story. Over time, church fathers re-evaluated the gods of the old world. They argued that these gods were not divine beings but dark spirits trying to mislead humanity. By changing the identity of the old gods, the church could convert an entire civilization without physically destroying it. It only needed to redefine what those gods were. What had once been worshipped would slowly become feared. And in that quiet transformation, Christianity would rise from a humble faith to an empire of belief, stretching across continents and centuries, supported by a story powerful enough to replace every god that came before it. When Christianity stepped into the seat of Roman power, it did not walk into an empty throne. It walked into a world crowded with gods. Everywhere a priest looked, there were temples shining with marble statues, sacred groves dedicated to ancient spirits, and households guarded by small shrines where families prayed each morning. Rome was not just an empire of soldiers and roads. It was an empire of deities. Jupiter ruled the skies. Mars guided warriors. Diana protected the forests and the hunt. Pan danced through the wild places where humans rarely ventured. These gods were not myths to the Roman people. They were part of life itself, and now the church had to face them. This was the problem no one spoke about openly. How can a new faith take control of an empire whose entire identity is tied to its gods? You cannot simply outlaw worship when it is woven into every celebration and every household ritual. You cannot demand people forget their gods when they believe these gods have protected their families for generations. The early bishops understood this. They knew that if Christianity tried to destroy these deities by force, the empire would tear itself apart. So they made a different choice. They would not erase the gods. They would redefine them. At first, this shift happened quietly. There were no public announcements, no grand speeches. Instead, Christian teachers began to speak about the pagan gods as if they were not gods at all. They suggested that the old deities were tricksters or lesser spirits pretending to be divine. By planting this idea in the minds of new converts, the church created the first cracks in the old belief system. People began to question the beings they once trusted. If Jupiter was truly powerful, why had Rome fallen into chaos? If Mars guided war, why did he not save the empire from invasion? Doubt is a powerful tool, and the church understood it well. As Christianity grew stronger, the message became bolder. The gods of Rome were no longer just lesser spirits. They were something far more dangerous. They were beings leading humanity away from salvation. They were forces who wanted to keep people trapped in the old ways so they could never find the truth of Christ. This was the moment when the pagan gods began their transformation. Not through war or destruction, but through words. A new story was being written, and in that story the gods of Rome were no longer protectors. They were enemies. The church also understood that imagery has power. When people saw statues of their gods standing proudly in temples, it reminded them of the world that came before. So Christian leaders repurposed temples, turning them into churches. Statues of Jupiter and Apollo were removed or destroyed. Sacred sites were rededicated to saints. Slowly, the entire empire was remodeled so that the old gods no longer had a physical home. Without places of worship, the memories of these gods weakened. By the time centuries passed and new generations were born, the transformation was nearly complete. The gods who had once shaped an empire were remembered only as dark spirits from an age of ignorance. Their stories were rewritten not as myths of creation but as warnings of evil. Rome's gods did not vanish. They were pushed into the shadows, renamed, recast, and ultimately turned into the very demons the church warned its followers about. And in that transformation, Christianity solved its greatest challenge by turning an empire of gods into an empire of faith. History rarely records the moments that truly change the world. Some of the most powerful decisions are made not on battlefields or inside grand palaces, but behind closed doors, in quiet rooms, where only a handful of men decide the fate of entire civilizations. One of those hidden moments took place during the early rise of Christianity, when bishops and scholars gathered to solve a problem that threatened the foundation of their new faith. What should they do with the gods of the old world? Not the myths, not the stories, but the countless deities people still prayed to every day. These gods were too deeply rooted in culture to be forgotten, yet they were too powerful in the minds of the people to be ignored. The church needed a solution, and it had to be one that would last for centuries. In those secret discussions, early theologians faced a truth they could not admit in public. The writings of Scripture did not mention Jupiter, or Mars, or Diana, or Apollo. The Bible had no instructions for dealing with entire pantheons, yet the church was expanding into lands overflowing with these gods. Every village had its own protectors, every forest had its own spirit, every river had its own guardian. These beings were alive in the memories of millions. To convert an empire, the church needed a strategy that was not only spiritual but psychological. They needed a way to change belief without creating rebellion. The debates went on for years. Some argued that the old gods should be dismissed as simple inventions, but the theologians understood people would not abandon deities they believed had answered their prayers. Others suggested a softer approach, presenting pagan gods as lesser beings with no real power. But this left too much room for people to cling to their old ways. The church needed a clean break between the past and the future, a line so clear that no one would dare cross it. And then came the idea that would reshape demonology forever. If the old gods could not be erased, they could be recast, not as harmless spirits or fading myths, but as something far more frightening. They could be labelled as fallen beings in rebellion against the Christian God. They could become deceivers, dark spirits masquerading as divine. They could become demons. This solution was perfect. It did not deny the existence of the old gods, which would have been impossible for the converts to accept. Instead, it reinterpreted them. It turned their power into a trap, their worship into danger, their legends into warnings. With one decision, the church transformed entire pantheons into an army of demons. From that moment forward, every deity of the ancient world was placed within a new hierarchy of evil. Pan, with his horns and wild nature, became an early blueprint for the devil. Diana, once the goddess of the moon, became tied to witchcraft. Jupiter was reduced to a rebellious spirit, pretending to rule the sky. Even local spirits of forests and rivers became classified as dangerous influences sent to mislead the faithful. The shift was slow, but relentless. Over generations, the meaning of these beings faded, and their new identity took hold. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, few remembered that these demons had once been gods honoured across continents. Their temples were forgotten, their stories twisted, their names spoken only as warnings. And all of it began in those hidden meetings, where a small group of men decided that the best way to defeat the old world was not through force, but through redefining the divine. In that quiet moment of strategy, a new demonology was born, and the gods of the ancient world were cast into darkness, where the church intended them to remain forever. When most people today imagine the devil, they picture a creature with horns, a goat-like face, hooves, a tail, and a wild grin filled with danger. But this image did not come from the Bible. It did not fall from heaven or rise from some ancient hell. It came from a god who once danced through forests, made shepherds laugh, and filled the hills of Greece with music. His name was Pan, and long before Christianity rose to power, he was one of the most beloved and misunderstood figures of the ancient world. His transformation from joyful nature spirit to symbol of absolute evil is one of the most deliberate acts of rebranding in human history. Pan was not feared in the old world. He was celebrated. people believed he guided hunters, protected animals, and brought life to the wilderness. His horns and hooves symbolized his connection to nature, not darkness. His wildness was a reminder that life could not always be contained. He was a being of freedom and energy. Yet when Christianity spread across Europe, church leaders saw something different. They saw a God who could not be absorbed into their system. They saw a figure too popular and too recognizable. So instead of trying to erase Pan, they decided to twist him. This was not done in one moment. It unfolded slowly across centuries. Artists began to paint Pan with darker features. Writers described him as a trickster who misled people. Priests warned that his appearance was a sign of wickedness. His joyful smile became a sneer. His music became a lure. His horns became a symbol of corruption. The church needed a face for evil one powerful enough to break the hold of the old gods. And Pan, with his striking appearance and deep connection to rural life, became the perfect candidate. The idea spread quickly because it served a purpose. Rural communities still clung to their ancient beliefs long after Christianity claimed the cities. These people told stories of Pan guiding their flocks or protecting them in the forests. Church leaders needed to break this bond, and fear was the easiest weapon. If Pan could be turned into a creature of darkness, then worship of him would become dangerous. People would abandon him not because they wanted to, but because they were terrified of what he now represented. It was not theology, it was strategy. As more time passed, the image of Pan merged with other rejected gods, forming the early shape of the Christian devil. Horns came from Pan. Hooves came from Pan. The wild grin came from Pan. Even the idea of sudden fear, the feeling called panic, was once tied to him. All these elements were gathered and moulded into an entirely new figure designed to overshadow every other ancient deity. This devil was meant to be frightening enough to erase the memory of the gods who came before. By the Middle Ages, the transformation was complete. The people no longer saw Pan as a playful forest spirit. They saw a monster who lurked in the shadows, waiting to claim souls. His temples crumbled. His name was whispered only as a warning. And the Christian devil became one of the most powerful symbols in history, built not from scripture, but from the remains of a god once loved by millions. The demonization of Pan marked the beginning of a much larger campaign, a campaign to turn the gods of the old world into the darkness that Christianity claimed to save humanity from. When Christianity stepped into the ruins of the ancient world, it faced a universe overflowing with gods and spirits. Every culture had its own cosmic order, with divine beings looking after the sky, the harvest, the storms, and even the journey of the soul after death. These pantheons were complex and deeply rooted, and the people who worshipped them knew exactly where their gods stood in the great chain of existence. For Christianity to rise, it needed more than sermons. It needed its own invisible world, a world that could replace everything people once believed in and still feel complete. So the church began to build a new cosmic structure, one carefully shaped to fill the void left by the fallen gods. In this new vision, the universe was arranged like a great staircase of light. At the top stood a single perfect God. Beneath him were ranks of powerful beings, each with specific duties. These beings were angels, but not the soft figures painted in later centuries. They were immense cosmic guardians, with roles that mirrored the ancient gods they replaced. One guided nations, one delivered messages, one protected the faithful in battle. Each angel took over a job once belonging to a pagan deity, and in doing so the church created a familiar yet transformed world. People could no longer pray to the gods they knew, but they could ask an angel for help in almost the same way. But a new order of light required a new order of darkness. As angels rose in this structure, there had to be an opposite force to explain suffering, fear, disaster, and temptation. The people of the ancient world had already believed in spirits that were unpredictable or dangerous. The church took this idea and shaped it into something far more organized. Demons were assigned ranks and identities, just like the old gods had been. They were given territories and skills. They were blamed for storms, sickness, sudden fear, and strange dreams. In the stories told by priests, demons took the roles once held by spirits of night, wild places, and the underworld. These beings were not simply evil. They were the shadows cast by the new world the church was building. As this system developed, it gave people a map of the unseen. It told them who to fear and who to trust. It explained why strange things happened in the world. It created a clear line between holy and forbidden. And most importantly, it prevented people from returning to the gods of the past. If an ancient deity appeared in a dream, it was not a guide. It was a demon. If a forest spirit seemed to whisper on the wind, it was not a guardian. It was a trap. The church did not need to erase the old beliefs when it could simply reinterpret them. Over time, the new cosmic hierarchy became so detailed that it felt older than it truly was. Angels were placed above as perfect servants of God. Demons were placed below as twisted enemies. The world became a battlefield of light and shadow. People no longer lived among many gods. They lived under one God, supported by a vast unseen host. And in that design, the church created a spiritual universe powerful enough to stand for centuries and to silence the ancient pantheons forever. In the earliest days of Christian expansion, the greatest challenge was not the mighty gods of Greece or Rome. It was the smaller gods, the quiet ones, the spirits who lived in rivers and forests and fields, the guardians who watched over villages and homes for thousands of years. These beings were not worshipped with grand temples or statues. They were honored with simple rituals, whispered prayers and offerings left on stones or at the roots of old trees. They were woven into the heartbeat of everyday life. People believed these spirits protected their families, guided their crops, guarded their children, and kept their homes safe from harm. They were part of the land itself. And when Christianity arrived, these ancient companions became the first targets in a silent war. The church could not allow these spirits to survive because they gave people a sense of independence. A farmer did not need a priest to bless his fields if he believed the river spirit already blessed them. A mother did not need a church to guard her baby if she trusted the household deity to keep watch. These small spirits represented a world where people held their own connection to the divine. So the church set out to break that bond, not through violence but through redefinition. They changed the meaning of these beings. They called them unclean. They called them deceptive. They called them the whispers of darkness, pretending to be friends. The shift was slow but powerful. Priests warned villagers that the spirits they trusted were not protectors, but enemies, trying to keep them from salvation. Every blessing once attributed to these spirits was now claimed to be a trick. Every misfortune was blamed on their anger. Fear replaced trust. Confusion replaced comfort. Whole communities were taught to doubt the very forces they once believed watched over them. And without that trust, people turned to the church for protection because there was nowhere else to turn. Over time, the spirits were pushed further into the shadows. Sacred springs once believed to heal were declared cursed and covered. Forests that held old shrines were cut down or claimed by the church. Household deities were said to be demons hiding in the walls. Even the simple act of leaving bread for a guardian spirit was now considered a sin. The world that had once felt alive with presence suddenly felt cold and empty. The silence that followed was not natural, it was forced. Generations later, the memories of these spirits faded. Children grew up hearing only warnings about dark forces hiding in nature. Elders who remembered the old beliefs stayed quiet to avoid punishment. A culture that once lived in harmony with the unseen world now feared it. The connection between people and land was rewritten. And with that single transformation, Christianity gained enormous power. When people no longer believed the spirits around them cared for them, they turned to the priests, who claimed they did. The war on ancient spirits was not fought with swords. It was fought with stories. It was fought with sermons. It was fought by turning familiar friends into frightening strangers. And when the battle was over, the old spirits were gone, not because they were defeated, but because their names were erased and their memory recast into shadows. When Christianity rose to power, it did not simply ask the world to change. It demanded that the old world be removed piece by piece until nothing remained to remind people of their former gods. This was not a peaceful transition. It was a quiet cleansing carried out through symbols and stories. The church understood that as long as the temples stood, as long as the groves remained untouched, and as long as the statues of ancient gods watched over the land, people would still feel the presence of their old beliefs. So the church began a campaign that would reshape the landscape of Europe and erase an entire spiritual memory. Temples were the first to fall because they were the most visible. These structures were built with devotion and skill, meant to honor gods who had guided civilizations for centuries. They stood on mountaintops, at crossroads, beside rivers, and in the hearts of cities. Instead of destroying them completely, the church chose a different approach. They repurposed them. Temples dedicated to Jupiter or Apollo were turned into churches almost overnight. The pillars remained, the walls stayed, but the altars were changed and the statues removed. The old sacred spaces became Christian homes of worship. To the people, it sent a powerful message. Your gods are gone. This place no longer belongs to them. Sacred groves were next. These ancient forests had always been places of ritual and wonder. People believed the spirits lived in the trees and the wind carried messages from the divine. The church declared these groves dangerous. They claimed the spirits inside were unclean. To save the people, these groves had to be cut down. Trees that had stood for hundreds of years were brought to the ground. Shrines hidden among the roots were smashed. The earth that once felt alive with mystery was left bare and empty. To justify this destruction, priests told the people that the groves were haunted by dark forces and cutting them down was an act of holy protection. Statues presented a more direct challenge. The faces of the old gods carved in stone reminded people of who they once were. They were a threat simply by existing. The church ordered many statues to be smashed. Faces were broken. Bodies were buried beneath churches or thrown into rivers. Some statues were hidden by believers, hoping to protect their heritage, but most disappeared forever. Once again, the church used a powerful claim. They said these statues were possessed. They insisted that dark spirits lived within them. By destroying them, the church claimed it was saving souls from danger. All these actions were part of one goal: to make sure the old world became impossible to return to. When people looked around and saw no signs of the gods they once loved, they began to believe those gods had truly vanished. The land itself was rewritten. The sacred became forbidden. The beloved became feared. And in this transformation, Christianity gained a level of control that no army could ever achieve. It replaced not only belief, but memory. And without memory, the old belief systems burned away like smoke in the wind. When people today imagine the devil, they see a horned monster with red skin, sharp teeth, hooves, and a stare that promises destruction. But this creature did not exist in the earliest days of Christianity. The Bible never described such a figure. The ancient followers of Christ did not speak of a terrifying Lord of darkness hiding beneath the world. Instead, the idea of Satan was vague, scattered, and symbolic. He was an accuser, a tempter, a voice of doubt, not a powerful ruler of an evil kingdom. The fearsome devil we recognize today was not born from Scripture. He was crafted. As Christianity expanded across Europe, the church faced a major challenge. The old gods refused to disappear. People still whispered their names. They still told stories about them. They still believed they walked the forests and guided the seasons. The church needed a way to make these gods not only unwanted but unthinkable. It needed a single figure so terrifying that no one would dare look back at the past. So the Vatican began shaping a new image. A being who combined the most frightening symbols of the ancient world. A creature who could overshadow every forgotten god. This construction was slow at first. Early Christian art showed Satan as a shadow or a serpent or a fallen angel without form. But as the church grew more powerful, the image began to change. Artists were encouraged to give the devil features that came from the pagan gods the church wanted people to fear. Pan had horns, so the devil was given horns. Fauns had goat legs, so the devil received hooves. Fearsome forest spirits bore wild eyes, so the devil gained a stare that burned with hatred. These features were not chosen at random. Each detail mocked the gods of the past, turning symbols of nature and freedom into signs of corruption and danger. By the Middle Ages, the devil had become a character far greater than anything found in the Bible. He was no longer a symbol of temptation. He was a king, a ruler of a vast underworld, a commander of countless demons. He was the main enemy of humanity. Stories began to describe him as constantly plotting to steal souls. Priests preached about him in every village. Artists carved his form onto church doors. His presence filled sermons, warnings, and tales told around fires. The church needed him to be real and terrifying, because the more powerful the devil became, the more powerful the church appeared in its battle against him. This new figure also served another purpose. If all the old gods had been demonized, the devil became their leader. The Vatican placed every pagan deity beneath him, making sure that no memory of the ancient world could survive without being tied to darkness. The gods once honored as guardians or teachers were now portrayed as servants of evil. This transformation did not just erase the past, it weaponized it. By the end of the medieval period, the devil was fully formed. He was the ultimate villain, a creation built from fear and strategy. And though millions believed he had always existed as the church described him, the truth is far stranger. The medieval devil was invented carefully, intentionally, and with a purpose. He was shaped to control the imagination of Europe and to overshadow every god who came before him. As the Middle Ages unfolded across Europe, a strange transformation settled over the land. The stories people once told about gods guiding the seasons, protecting the forests, and watching over the rivers began to fade. In their place, new stories emerged, stories filled with shadows, whispers, and warnings. Tales of demons lurking near old temples, creatures stalking lonely paths at night, dark figures slipping into villages when the moon was hidden. This shift did not happen by accident. It was shaped by the rise of demonological texts, written and circulated by the church, to replace ancient myths with fear. These texts grew thicker every century, filled with detailed descriptions of demons, their ranks, their powers, and their tricks. They claimed that demons were everywhere, waiting for a moment of weakness. Priests used these writings to warn people that even the smallest mistake could open a door to darkness. The old gods who once brought comfort were now described as monsters trying to drag souls away from salvation. The stories that had guided families for generations were replaced by threats of hidden enemies. It became dangerous to believe in anything outside the church, because every alternative was called demonic. Fear is a powerful force, and the church knew how to use it. As stories of devils spread, entire villages began to tremble at the slightest unexplained sound. A sudden illness was blamed on a demon. A lost cow became a sign of possession. A strange dream meant an attack from the shadows. People no longer walked through forests without clutching a cross. They avoided springs and caves that had once been sacred. Even the wind moving through trees could make a town fall silent. The fear was not of nature itself, but of what the church said lived inside it. The shadow grew deeper as the church encouraged these tales. Sermons described demons hiding in places where the old gods were once honored. Priests warned that spirits still lingered in abandoned temples, waiting to deceive anyone who stepped inside. Stories began to paint the land as a battlefield between angels and demons. The people saw themselves not as part of nature, but as victims trapped between unseen forces. This new worldview made the church the only source of safety. It was no longer enough to live a good life. You had to seek protection. And the only protection offered came from the church. As the years passed, fear became a normal part of daily life. Children grew up hearing stories, not of wise gods or gentle spirits, but of claws in the dark. Parents taught their families to avoid the forest at night because evil walked there. Travelers warned each other not to stop near old ruins. Even festivals tied to the harvest or the solstice were reshaped to avoid any hint of their pagan roots. Step by step, Europe forgot that it once danced and celebrated with its gods. The shadow that spread over Europe was not the work of demons. It was the work of stories crafted to replace the old world with a new one built on fear rather than wonder. And once fear took hold, it became the most effective weapon the church had ever created. Long before Christianity ruled Europe, the ancient world was guided and guarded by powerful goddesses. Their names were spoken in temples and whispered during childbirth. Their symbols were carved into amulets worn by travelers, and their stories were passed from mothers to daughters. Isis was honored as the protector of life. Artemis watched over women and the wild. Hecate guided souls through the night. These goddesses were not feared. They were respected and loved because they represented mystery, strength, healing, intuition, and all the forces of nature that men could not control. But once Christianity rose to power, everything changed. A world that had once celebrated the divine feminine suddenly turned against it. The church could not allow the worship of female deities to continue because goddess traditions gave women spiritual authority and independence. A midwife could call upon a goddess instead of a priest. A mother could bless her children without the church. A village could offer prayers to Artemis rather than to Christ. This freedom was a threat to the new religious order. So the church created a plan to destroy the power of the goddesses, not by denying they existed, but by turning them into the very thing people were taught to fear. The transformation began with language. Priests started calling the goddesses false queens, or spirits of deception. They said these beings were not divine, but dangerous. They warned that behind their beauty was darkness. Slowly, the goddesses who once protected women were recast as enemies of heaven. Their symbols became forbidden. Their stories were rewritten as curses. And their ancient rituals were described as witchcraft. What had once been a blessing became a threat. As time passed, the church pushed this idea even further. Isis, the mother figure of ancient Egypt, was recast as a sorceress who misled the faithful. Artemis became a symbol of rebellion associated with wildness and witch gatherings. Hecate, who guided souls through the night, was turned into a queen of demons ruling over spirits of the dead. The feminine mysteries that once gave women strength were now labelled as evil arts. This transformation was not only spiritual, it was political. It shifted the balance of power by removing women from any role of divine authority. The more the church spread these ideas, the more fear grew. People were told that women who prayed to the old goddesses were not worshippers but witches. They were accused of summoning demons when they were simply practicing ancient traditions. Even herbal healers, midwives, and wise women became targets because their knowledge came from a time before Christianity. The goddesses they once served were now described as infernal queens, leading armies of dark spirits. Entire cultures lost their protectors overnight because believing in them became a crime. By the time the Middle Ages reached their height, no one dared speak the names of these goddesses aloud. The symbols of Isis, Artemis, and Hecate vanished from homes and temples. In their place rose warnings about succubi, dark queens, and witches. The divine feminine was buried under centuries of fear. Yet the truth is simple. These beings were never demons. They were turned into demons to erase a world where women and the natural world held spiritual power. The church did not defeat the goddesses, it rewrote them. Long before the rise of Christianity, the symbol of the horn was not a sign of evil. It was a sign of nature, strength, and the cycle of life. Across Europe, many ancient cultures honoured gods who carried horns as symbols of the wild world. Cernunnos guarded the animals and the forests. Pan filled the hills with laughter and music. Veles watched over the underworld and protected herds. These gods were not feared. They were respected because people understood that nature itself had a wild side. The horn was simply a reminder that the world could not be controlled by human hands. But when the church began spreading across Europe, this symbol became the center of one of the most powerful rebranding efforts in history. To the early Christians, the horned gods created a problem. They were too popular, too familiar, and too deeply rooted in the daily lives of the people. Hunters prayed to Cernunnos before entering the woods. Shepherds felt Veles walking beside them through the fields. Travelers believed Pan could lead them safely across mountains. The church knew it could not erase these gods quickly, so it chose a different tactic. It turned the horn into a mark of evil. A simple symbol that once meant nature and strength was transformed into proof of devil worship. Priests began to preach that the horned gods were not guardians, but dark spirits trying to mislead humanity. They claimed the horns represented rebellion against heaven. They taught that anyone who prayed to these beings was stepping into dangerous territory. The people were told that the gods they had trusted were not gods at all, but demons wearing familiar shapes. This idea spread faster than any soldier or missionary ever could, because fear is contagious. It sneaks into the mind quietly, and it changes everything. Suddenly, the forests that once felt alive with protective spirits became places of danger. People were warned to avoid the old shrines hidden among the trees. Hunting rituals that had been practiced for centuries were now called sinful. Even carvings of horned animals were treated with suspicion. The church used every tool it had to cut the connection between the people and their ancient protectors. It told stories of demons taking the form of animals. It claimed the horn was a sign of possession. It insisted that nature itself could not be trusted. The demonization grew stronger with each generation. Artists painted the Christian devil using the same horns that had once belonged to Pan and Cernunnos. Sculptors created frightening images with twisted faces and goat legs. These pictures were not inspired by scripture. They were inspired by the horned gods of Europe. The church knew that if it made the horn look terrifying, people would never return to their old beliefs. And the plan worked. Over time, the horn became the most feared symbol in the Christian world. By the end of the Middle Ages, no one remembered the original meaning of the horn. The gods who once protected the forests and fields were buried under centuries of fear. Their stories survived only as warnings whispered by priests. But the truth remains clear. The horn was never a curse. It became a curse only when the church chose to rewrite its meaning. Deep beneath the Vatican, where sunlight has never touched, there are shelves that hold some of the strangest manuscripts ever written. They are thick books, bound in dark leather. Their pages are filled with symbols, circles, and names that never appear in the Bible. These are the Demonology manuals. They describe hundreds of demons in unbelievable detail. They list their ranks, their weaknesses, their abilities, and even the signs used to summon or repel them. For a religion that claimed to fear evil, the church seemed surprisingly comfortable writing about it with precision. The mystery is not just what these books contain, but who created them and why the church kept them hidden from the world. When people think of demons, they imagine vague ideas of darkness and temptation. Yet the demonology manuals tell a very different story. They present a structured kingdom of evil complete with rulers, generals, scouts, and messengers. They give each demon a name and a symbol. Some are said to control storms, others are linked to sickness. Some whisper lies to kings while others hide in forests. The level of detail is so specific that it raises a haunting question. How did the church know any of this? None of it appears in Scripture. The Bible names only a handful of spiritual beings, yet the Vatican's manuals list hundreds. These books do not read like guesses, they read like records. Many scholars believe these manuals were not created in a single moment, but formed slowly over centuries. Early priests trying to convert pagan villages needed knowledge about the old gods. They collected stories about spirits, nature, beings, and protective deities. They learned local traditions and symbols. Then they rewrote them. A spirit of the harvest became a demon of greed. A guardian of the forest became a demon of mischief. A trickster god became a demon of lies. Page by page, the church turned the pantheons of Europe into a demonic empire. The demonology manuals were the result. But this theory does not explain everything. Some of the symbols drawn in the manuals appear in cultures far beyond Europe. Some match markings found in the Middle East. Others resemble shapes carved into ancient stones long before Christianity. It was as if the authors had access to knowledge that did not belong to their time. Knowledge collected from forgotten civilizations or seized from secret archives. This is why many believe the manuals were written by a group of scholars who were never meant to be known by name. They studied everything banned or forbidden. They combined myths, legends, and whispers into a single terrifying system. So why hide these books? Because if the public saw them, they would ask questions the church could not answer. Why did the church know so much about demons? Why did they write more about evil spirits than about angels? Why did their descriptions match gods that came before Christianity? The manuals were dangerous not because of the demons, but because of the truth hidden between the lines. They revealed how much the church had borrowed, twisted, and renamed. Today the manuals remain locked away. Only a small number of scholars are allowed to request pages, and even they cannot access everything. But the existence of these books proves one thing. The church did not simply fight the old gods. It documented them, it studied them, and then it transformed them into the demons we fear today. Across the ancient world, long before the rise of Christianity, communities depended on people who understood the secrets of the earth. Herbalists knew which plants could heal fevers or stop bleeding. Shamans guided the sick through dreams. Druids studied the stars and the cycles of the moon. Healers carried knowledge passed down through generations. None of this was strange. It was normal. People trusted these figures more than rulers, and sometimes even more than priests. But when the church began spreading its influence, these traditions became a direct threat. Anyone who could help the community without relying on the church weakened its authority. So rather than compete, the church chose to criminalize the entire world of folk magic. The shift began quietly. Priests started warning villagers that herbal knowledge might come from dangerous spirits. They claimed that shamans traveled not through dreams, but through demonic realms. Druids were accused of calling on forbidden powers. Healers who used ancient symbols or chants were said to be under the influence of dark forces. These claims were not based on evidence. They were based on fear and strategy. If people believed that folk magic was dangerous, they would run to the church for protection. They would rely on priests for healing rather than on the traditions of their ancestors. By the time the Middle Ages took hold, the church had changed the meaning of magic itself. It was no longer seen as a natural part of life. It became a word linked to evil. The same rituals that once helped entire villages survive winters or plagues were now labelled as demonic. People who had spent their lives healing others suddenly found themselves accused of causing harm. Even owning certain herbs became suspicious. A simple jar of dried leaves hidden in a cottage could be used as proof of witchcraft. The church pushed this idea further by creating laws and punishments. Councils declared that anyone practicing the old ways was guilty of heresy. Some regions issued warnings, others issued death sentences. Trials were held in secret rooms where the accused had no chance to defend themselves. Confessions were forced through fear. People who had never harmed anyone were punished simply for knowing too much. Folk magic became a crime not because it was dangerous, but because it gave power to ordinary people. Families learned to hide their traditions. Mothers who once taught their daughters how to mix healing salves stopped passing that knowledge on. Shamans stopped performing rituals in the open. Druids were pushed deeper into the forests. Healers burned their herb books out of fear. It was one of the greatest cultural losses in European history. Centuries of wisdom vanished in a single generation. All because the church said that knowledge belonged only to God and only priests could speak for him. By the end of the medieval period, folk magic had been erased from public life. The world that once thrived on connection to nature now believed nature itself was suspicious. But the truth is simple. These people were never consorting with demons. They were practicing the oldest form of science. The church criminalized them not to protect the faithful, but to protect its monopoly on knowledge and power. For most of ancient history, the word witch did not strike fear. It meant a wise woman, someone who understood the earth, the seasons, the hidden rhythms of life. She was the person villagers went to when a child was sick, or when a birth was difficult, or when a family needed guidance. Her knowledge came from generations of women who observed the world with careful eyes. But as the church tightened its control over Europe, these women became more than harmless healers. They became competitors. They held influence outside the church, and that made them dangerous. So the church began the slow, deliberate work of turning wise women into enemies of God. The change did not begin with superstition. It began with strategy. Church leaders realized that to gain total control over the spiritual life of Europe, they had to remove anyone who could offer help or wisdom without their permission. The midwife who blessed a newborn. The healer who used herbs instead of prayers. The old woman who knew the stories of the ancient gods. These figures weakened the church's monopoly. So priests began planting the idea that these women were not blessed but cursed, not healers but servants of dark forces. They claimed that the knowledge of these women came from the devil rather than from nature. At first, even villagers resisted this idea. They knew these women. They had grown up with them. They had seen them save lives. But fear is a slow poison, and the church knew how to feed it drop by drop. A failed healing became a sign of demonic influence. A strange dream was a warning that a witch lived nearby. A sudden death was blamed not on sickness, but on sorcery. People started to turn against the very women who had once protected them. Fear did what force never could. It changed the beliefs of entire communities. Then came the official writings. Church scholars created manuals that described witches in horrifying detail. They wrote that witches made pacts with the devil. They said witches could cause storms and diseases. They claimed witches stole souls in the night. None of this came from real stories. It came from the need to create a new enemy, a clear villain who could justify punishment and control. These texts spread across Europe, and wherever they appeared, panic followed. Villagers whispered about witches hiding among them. Priests warned that the devil walked in familiar shapes. Suspicion grew until every woman who lived alone became a target. By the 1500s, the fear had grown into full-scale hunts. People were dragged from their homes, accused without evidence, and forced to confess crimes that never happened. The church insisted it was protecting the faithful from evil, but the truth behind the hunts was political. It was a way to remove anyone who threatened their authority. When a wise woman was burned, the church gained more control. When a healer was executed, villages had no choice but to rely on priests. Every trial was another step in rewriting Europe's spiritual identity. The witch hunts did not explode because people believed in magic. They exploded because the church needed an enemy. Witches became the perfect target, wise enough to threaten authority, powerless enough to be destroyed, and feared enough that few dared to defend them. And so thousands of innocent women were erased, not because they were witches, but because they were inconvenient. There was a time when the pursuit of knowledge was seen as a sacred journey. In the ancient world, alchemists searched for the secrets of transformation, believing that the world was full of hidden truths waiting to be unlocked. Astrologers studied the sky, convinced that the stars carried messages from the divine. Geometers traced perfect shapes, believing that the universe was built on harmony and order. These were not dangerous ideas. They were respected paths to understanding life, nature, and the cosmos. But as the church began shaping the new spiritual order, these sciences became threats. Knowledge that did not flow through the church's hands had to be stopped. And so the long process of demonizing knowledge began. The church's fear was simple. Knowledge is power. Anyone who understood the natural world did not have to rely on miracle stories. Anyone who read the stars could make predictions without asking a priest. Anyone who mastered the patterns of geometry could understand the architecture of the universe. These people could think for themselves. They could question, and questioning was the greatest danger of all. So the church drew a new line, dividing the world of thought into two categories. Holy knowledge, which came from scripture and supported church authority, and forbidden knowledge, which came from anywhere else. Alchemy was the first to fall under suspicion. Alchemists spoke of the transformation of metals and the transformation of the soul. They believed that the world was alive with spiritual energy. To the church, this sounded too much like the ancient pagan teachings it was trying to erase. Priests declared that alchemists were meddling with dark forces. They accused them of trying to control creation in ways only God was allowed to. This accusation spread until even simple experiments were called demonic. Many alchemists abandoned their work or hid their writings deep underground. Astrology suffered an even harsher fate. For thousands of years, people believed the heavens guided human destiny. Kings consulted astrologers. Farmers planted crops according to the stars. But the church claimed that reading the sky was an attempt to bypass God's will. They declared that looking for meaning in the stars was no different from summoning demons. Yet in secret, the church continued to chart astronomical events using the same methods they forbade the public from using. They needed astrology to maintain the calendar. They just did not want ordinary people to have access to it. Geometry was perhaps the most surprising victim. The perfect shapes drawn by ancient mathematicians became symbols the church associated with forbidden knowledge. The triangle, the circle, the spiral all carried meanings tied to the old mystery schools. These shapes were used by masons, builders, and scholars who traced their ideas back to civilizations older than Christianity. Instead of embracing this knowledge, the church claimed it belonged to hidden cults. Anyone using geometry for sacred purposes was accused of practicing occult arts. As the centuries passed, the demonization of knowledge spread into every corner of learning. Curiosity became a risk. Discovery became a danger. Entire fields of study disappeared from public life. The world entered a silence not because people forgot how to think, but because they were afraid to. And the church maintained control not by destroying knowledge, but by labeling it forbidden. The most powerful chains were never made of iron. They were made of fear. When Christianity spread across Europe, the church faced a problem that no army or doctrine alone could solve. People loved their festivals. They loved their solstice fires, their harvest feasts, their celebrations of the dead, and their dances under the stars. These traditions were older than cities, older than kings, and older than written language itself. Festivals were not just parties, they were the rhythm of life. Trying to erase them would have sparked rebellion. So instead of destroying these celebrations, the church created a new strategy. It absorbed them. It gave them new names, new meanings, and new saints, while quietly burying the gods who once stood at their center. The winter solstice was the most important festival in many ancient cultures. It marked the longest night of the year and the return of the sun. For thousands of years, people lit fires, sang songs, and celebrated the rebirth of light. When the church arrived, it could not stop this celebration, so it gave it a new title, the birth of Christ. Even though no one knew the exact date of Jesus' birth, the church declared that it happened near the solstice. The old holiday survived, but its meaning was rewritten. The sun god was forgotten. The Son of God took his place. The same transformation happened with Samhain, the Celtic festival, marking the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead. On this night, people honoured ancestors, lit candles, and believed the veil between worlds had thinned. The church could not stamp out these beliefs, so it created All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. Suddenly, the ancient rituals were allowed again, but only if they honoured Christian saints. The spirits of old were replaced with approved figures. The festival remained, but its soul was claimed by the church. Across Europe, the pattern repeated again and again. Spring fertility celebrations became Easter. Harvest festivals became feasts of saints. Rituals meant to honour earth gods were repurposed as ceremonies for the Virgin Mary. Even the decorated trees of midwinter were adopted and presented as symbols of paradise. The people continued to celebrate, but the gods at the heart of these traditions were declared demons or forgotten entirely. The church did not erase paganism by force. It erased it by imitation. This strategy was brilliant because it allowed the church to blend into the lives of the people. A villager could attend Mass in the morning and still dance around the same fire at night. But over generations, the memory of why these rituals existed faded. Children grew up thinking the festivals were Christian from the beginning. The ancient gods became nameless shadows. Their stories were erased not by banning them, but by replacing them with stories the church controlled. By the end of the Middle Ages, nearly every major Christian holiday carried the bones of an older pagan celebration. The church condemned the original gods as false or demonic, while building its calendar on the foundation they created. The festivals that once honoured the cycles of nature now served the cycles of the church. Yet if you look closely at these holidays, even today, you can still see traces of the old world. A reminder that no matter how much the church tried to overwrite the past, the ancient traditions refused to fully die. Long before Christianity shaped the world, the East had already built complex maps of the unseen. The ancient Persians spoke of devas, spirits of chaos who tried to pull humanity away from truth. The Babylonians feared and respected beings who moved through the night carrying messages from the realm of shadows. The Egyptians believed in nether beings who guided souls through the afterlife, helping or challenging them along the way. These forces were not simple villains. They were part of a rich spiritual landscape that explained why storms came, why sickness spread, and why dreams sometimes felt like doors to another world. Every culture had its own demonology, and none of them looked like the Christian idea of a single devil ruling an army of darkness. But when the church grew powerful enough to rewrite the spiritual map of the world, it faced a problem. These ancient systems were too old, too detailed, and too respected to simply erase. They were the roots of civilizations that stretched back thousands of years. So instead of destroying them openly, the church chose a quieter path. It absorbed their ideas or buried them so deeply that only fragments survived. And in the process, it created the illusion that Christianity had always held the only real understanding of good and evil. The Persian devas were among the first to be rewritten. In ancient Persian belief, they were once gods who fell into corruption, beings that chose lies over truth. This idea deeply influenced early Christian thought. The church borrowed the concept of fallen beings and used it to build a narrative of rebellious angels who became demons. Yet Christianity erased the Persian origins. It claimed the idea came from divine revelation rather than from a culture older than the Bible. The devas faded into obscurity, while the Christian demon took their place. Babylon had its own powerful system of spirits. Some were protectors, some caused nightmares, some wandered between worlds, carrying messages from the dead. Clay tablets described rituals meant to defend homes from harmful spirits, and prayers used to call upon friendly ones. When the church encountered these traditions, it labelled every spirit as evil. The protector spirits were forgotten, and the harmful ones were twisted into Christian demons. Babylonian demonology, which once explained the relationship between humans and the unseen, was reduced to a single note of terror. The church made sure that only the darkest pieces survived. Egyptian beliefs were perhaps the most complex of all. The nether beings, who lived in the Duat, guided souls through a journey filled with challenges and judgments. They represented transformation, not evil, but the church could not allow such an independent view of the afterlife to stand. It recast these beings as monsters and claimed that the Egyptian underworld was a realm of demons. The idea of souls evolving after death was replaced with fear-driven visions of hell. Egyptian wisdom, which had shaped civilizations for millennia, disappeared beneath the church's narrative. The most revealing part of this transformation is how quietly it happened. No great battles, no open debates, just slow absorption and careful removal. The Vatican built its demonology not from scripture alone, but from the ruins of older worlds. Then it hid those origins to protect its authority. Today, most people have never heard of devas, Babylonian spirits, or Egyptian nether beings. Their stories were pushed into darkness so that one story could rise above them all. The story the church wanted the world to believe. Among the many secrets whispered about the Vatican, none has stirred more curiosity and fear than the story of a hidden manuscript created by the Jesuits. It is said that somewhere beneath the ancient stone walls lies a book unlike any other. A codex filled with maps, names, sigils, and origins of every demon ever recorded by the church. But what makes this book even more mysterious is not the demons themselves. It is the idea that each entry traces back to older pagan gods and spirits. A forbidden atlas of the supernatural linking Christianity's greatest enemies to the ancient world it tried to erase. No one outside the highest ranks has ever seen it yet. Stories about the Jesuit Codex continue to spread through academic circles and quiet conversations between scholars who have stumbled upon hints of its existence. The Jesuits were known for their obsession with knowledge. They travelled across continents, collecting texts, artifacts, and stories from every culture they encountered. They studied languages no one in Europe had ever heard. They documented beliefs that others considered dangerous. And according to legend, they kept what they discovered in secret archives far from ordinary eyes. If a codex of demons exists, the Jesuits were the ones capable of creating it. They would have compared ancient mythologies, connected symbols across cultures, and traced the transformation of gods into demons with a level of detail that would shock the world if revealed. The supposed codex does not describe demons as chaotic creatures, but organizes them with precision. It is said to map where each spirit was first worshipped, the culture it belonged to, and the rituals once used to call upon it. It draws lines that stretch from the forests of Europe to the temples of the Middle East and the pyramids of Egypt. In this hidden book, demons are not inventions of fear. They are echoes of ancient divinities, stripped of honor and reshaped into threats. The Church may have demonized these beings, but the Codex shows their true history before they were rewritten. One of the strangest rumors claims the Codex includes detailed maps marking locations where certain gods were worshipped long before Christianity. These maps supposedly note how the Church built monasteries over sacred pagan sites, and how shrines were replaced with churches to erase old traditions. The Codex may even describe how certain gods were absorbed into the Christian narrative, while others were transformed into terrifying figures to scare people away from returning to their roots. If this is true, then the Codex is not just a record of demons. It is a record of how history was sculpted. Some believe the Codex was never meant to be evil. It was created as a reference for missionaries, so they could understand the spiritual systems they were trying to replace. But as the Church grew more powerful, the book became dangerous. It revealed too much. It showed the origins of too many Christian ideas, and so it was hidden away, locked beneath layers of silence. Those who claim to have glimpsed fragments speak carefully, afraid of drawing attention. A single sketch, a list of names matching ancient gods, a map with symbols no one can openly discuss. Pieces that hint at a secret too big to expose. The Jesuit Codex remains a mystery. Whether it sits locked behind iron doors or survived only in fragments, its legend reveals one truth. The Church knew the old gods far better than it ever admitted. It mapped them, catalogued them, and transformed them. And somewhere in those hidden pages lies the story the world was never meant to read. Before Christianity swept across Europe and the ancient world, countless cultures practiced rituals meant to connect the human spirit with the divine. Shamans entered trances to speak with ancestors. Druids used rhythmic chanting to reach higher states of awareness. Priestesses danced in sacred circles to call upon goddesses. These were not moments of fear. They were moments of connection. People believed they were stepping into a world just beyond sight, where wisdom waited to be heard. But when the Church rose to power, it needed to discredit these experiences. It could not allow anyone to communicate with the spiritual world without its approval. So it created one of the most powerful ideas in human history. The idea of demonic possession. The change began slowly. Priests claimed that any altered state of consciousness was not a bridge to the divine, but an invasion by evil spirits. A shaman trembling during a trance was said to be under the control of a demon. A woman who spoke in a different voice during a ritual was labelled as possessed. Even dreams that felt too real were considered signs that dark forces had entered the mind. The Church took the same experiences that had once been sacred and turned them into evidence of danger. Fear replaced trust. Suspicion replaced wonder. As this new belief spread, the Church introduced a dramatic solution: exorcism. A ritual that they alone could perform. A ritual that proved only Christianity had the authority to fight the unseen. This was not just spiritual strategy. It was political genius. If people believed they could be possessed, they would naturally run to the Church for protection. And if the Church presented itself as the only force able to battle demons, then its power became unquestionable. Other religions could offer wisdom or healing, but only Christianity could save a soul from an invisible enemy. Stories of possession exploded across Europe. A person having a seizure was said to be attacked by demons. A child talking to an imaginary friend was considered at risk. A healer in a trance was accused of opening gateways to evil. Villagers who once trusted in their ancient traditions now feared them. People who once danced in rituals now avoided the night. The Church fueled these fears with sermons and testimonies that described terrifying encounters with demonic forces. Many of these stories were exaggerated or invented, but they served their purpose. They made the people dependent on the church. Exorcism became a spectacle. Priests performed dramatic rituals in front of crowds, holding crosses, chanting scriptures, and commanding invisible spirits to flee. To the people, these rituals proved that the church fought on their behalf. They did not know that many of the signs of possession resembled the natural effects of trance rituals. They did not realize that the church was using their own cultural practices against them. What had once been a sacred spiritual experience was now the strongest weapon the church used to maintain control. By the end of the Middle Ages, the idea of demonic possession had become deeply rooted in the collective mind. People forgot that trance rituals were once seen as gateways to knowledge. They forgot that many cultures embraced these moments as communication with the divine. The church did not destroy these traditions, it redefined them, and in doing so it created one of the most powerful tools in its history. A fear so deep that people willingly surrendered their spiritual freedom for the promise of protection. The ultimate weapon was not the demon. It was the belief in the demon. If you walk into a grand cathedral today, the scents, the sounds, and the symbols feel ancient and holy. The flicker of candlelight, the smoke of incense drifting through the air, the ringing of bells, the shimmering robes worn by priests, the water touched to the forehead. To many, these are timeless Christian traditions, but hidden beneath them lies a truth that few ever learn. These practices existed long before Christianity. They were born in the temples and sacred groves of the ancient pagan world. And while the church condemned the gods behind those rituals, it quietly kept the rituals themselves. Holy water is one of the clearest examples. Long before the church blessed water in the name of Christ, pagans used sacred springs and rivers for purification. The Celts placed bowls of water at the entrance of temples. The Egyptians washed before entering shrines. The Romans sprinkled water during ceremonies to honor their gods. Water was seen as a bridge between the human world and the divine. When Christianity rose to power, it adopted the practice almost exactly as it was. The meaning remained purification, but the original gods connected to it were erased. Incense tells another story. Burning fragrant herbs was common in ancient temples across the world. It was believed that smoke carried prayers to the heavens. The Babylonians burned incense to connect with celestial spirits. The Greeks used it in healing rituals. The Egyptians filled their temples with it to honor Osiris and Isis. When the church adopted incense, it claimed the practice symbolized prayers rising to God. The smoke stayed the same. The meaning stayed the same. Only the names changed. Relics' veneration of bones, objects or clothing linked to holy beings is also deeply rooted in pagan belief. The Celts honored the bones of their heroes. The Romans kept sacred items connected to their legendary figures. Many ancient cultures believed that the spirit lingered in personal objects. The church condemned these ideas as superstition, yet it built an entire tradition of relics around the same concept. Saints replaced heroes. Churches replaced shrines. The belief remained untouched beneath a new label. Even the ringing of bells has old roots. Bells were used in pagan rituals to protect sacred spaces and to call spirits away from the living. In many villages, they were rung to scare away harmful entities during eclipses or storms. The church adopted bells to signal the start of Mass, to bless the air around a community and to ward off evil. Once again, the action stayed the same, but its origin was forgotten. The ornate robes worn by priests mirror the garments of pagan priests who believed special clothing carried symbolic power. Even the design of many Christian altars resembles ancient stone altars where offerings were placed for gods long forgotten. The church covered these similarities by changing the story behind them. Yet the echoes of the old world remain in every flickering candle, and every whispered prayer. The adoption of pagan rituals was not an accident. It was a strategy. The church understood that people would accept a new religion more easily if it felt familiar, so it kept the rituals but buried their meanings. Over generations, people forgot where these traditions came from. They believed the church had invented them, but in the shadows of every cathedral, the ancient world still speaks through symbols the church tried to hide. By the time the Renaissance dawned on Europe, the church had spent over 1,000 years burying the ancient gods under layers of fear, superstition, and rewritten stories. But something unexpected happened when artists and scholars began searching for forgotten knowledge. As they opened dusty manuscripts, translated old languages, and studied ruins that had been silent for centuries, they stumbled upon the names the church tried so hard to erase. Zeus, Isis, Apollo, Hecate, Hermes. These names rose from the shadows like echoes refusing to die. The Renaissance became a rebirth, not only of art and science, but of ancient memory. And the church struggled to contain a revival it never saw coming. It began with scholars who were hungry to understand the past. They travelled to libraries in Greece and the Middle East, hunting for lost texts. They brought back scrolls written by philosophers who lived long before Christianity: Plato, Pythagoras, Plotinus. These thinkers spoke freely of gods, spirits, and cosmic forces. As their works were copied and shared, they sparked a fascination with the ancient world. People realized that before fear took over, humanity had explored the universe with curiosity and awe. The church tried to frame these texts as mere philosophy, but readers felt something deeper. The old gods were whispering through the pages. Artists soon followed. When painters and sculptors looked at ancient statues, they saw beauty instead of danger. They recreated the forms of Athena and Apollo in marble and paint. These images appeared in palaces, academies, and private collections. They were not presented as demons, but as symbols of wisdom, strength, and divine inspiration. Even though the church disapproved, it could not fully stop the movement. Wealthy patrons who funded the church also funded the artists. This created a silent conflict. The church preached against paganism, while its supporters decorated their homes with images of pagan gods. Then came the secret societies. Groups like the Hermeticists and early alchemists gathered in hidden rooms to study ancient teachings. They believed the church had stolen sacred wisdom from the old world and buried it. They sought to restore this knowledge by reading banned books and practicing forgotten rituals. Some claimed to communicate with the same divine forces honored by the ancients. They used symbols like the caduceus, the Ouroboros, and the pentacle symbols far older than Christianity. These groups grew quietly, spreading ideas that the church could not control. The more the Renaissance celebrated ancient wisdom, the more the church panicked. It accused scholars of heresy and warned that the old gods were demons in disguise. It banned certain books and even burned manuscripts that threatened its authority. But it was too late. The ancient world had already slipped back into the imagination of Europe. People now questioned why the church had worked so hard to hide these stories. They wondered what else had been rewritten. The Renaissance did not fully restore the worship of the old gods, but it restored something just as powerful: curiosity. It reminded people that history was larger than the church allowed them to believe. The ancient gods returned through art, beauty, and knowledge. And though the church tried to silence them, these names lived on, painted into ceilings, carved into stone, and whispered through the halls of secret societies. The forbidden gods had been reborn. When most people today imagine a demon, they see the same picture: red skin, sharp teeth, horns curling from the forehead, wings made of shadow, eyes glowing like fire. These images dominate horror movies, video games, and even Halloween costumes. They feel ancient, as if humanity has always imagined demons this way. But the truth is surprising. The modern demon is not a biblical figure. It is not described in the early Christian texts. Instead, it is a creation born from medieval Vatican propaganda, shaped to scare people away from the old gods and into the arms of the church. What we fear today is not an ancient monster, it is a medieval invention. In the Bible, demons are vague. They have no fixed shape. They do not have horns or hooves. They do not wear wings or carry weapons. They are simply spirits of chaos or sickness. The devil himself appears only a few times and never as a horned ruler of darkness. But during the Middle Ages, the church needed a powerful enemy to justify its growing authority. It wanted people to believe the world was a battlefield between good and evil. So artists were encouraged to create terrifying images. Priests described demons in ways that had more to do with pagan gods than with scripture. Horned deities like Pan and Cernunnos were grafted onto the Christian devil. Strange spirits from Europe, Africa, and the Middle East were mixed together to create monstrous forms. These images were copied into manuscripts, carved into church walls, and painted into stained glass windows. The average person who could not read learned a demonology from what they saw. A horned creature with wings, a beast with the legs of a goat, a face twisted into rage. Over time, these images became the official version of evil, and as generations passed, people forgot where the features came from. The demon became real, not because scripture proved it, but because art repeated it so often. When modern storytelling began in the 19th and 20th centuries, it borrowed heavily from these medieval images. Writers who created early horror novels used Catholic descriptions of demons because they were dramatic and frightening. Later filmmakers took these same visuals and turned them into nightmares on screen. The Exorcist created a new wave of demon fear, even though none of its imagery appears in the Bible. Modern shows and movies copied the same designs without questioning their origins. The pop culture demon became a character built from medieval imagination. Even today, when people claim to see demons during sleep paralysis or extreme fear, their descriptions match the church's medieval art, not ancient texts. This shows how deeply these images have entered the human mind. They shape our dreams, our nightmares, and our expectations. But the truth behind the modern demonology myth is simple. The Vatican spent centuries building these images to replace the memory of the old gods. The horns were borrowed from Pan. The wings came from ancient Persian spirits. The monstrous bodies came from European forest gods. The church stitched them all together and called the result evil. Modern culture believes it inherited these ideas from ancient times, but it inherited them from artists, monks, and priests who used fear as a tool. The demon we see today is not an ancient creature lurking in the shadows. It is a medieval mask, crafted to hide the faces of forgotten gods. Imagine for a moment that the story we have been told for centuries is not the full story. Imagine that the beings we fear, the ones described as monsters, shadows, and enemies, were never meant to frighten us at all. What if they were guides, teachers, and protectors, belonging to a world that came before ours? A world erased so completely that we only remember its echoes in myths and symbols. The church spent centuries telling us to fear these beings, calling them demons, and warning us never to speak their names. But what if the danger was never the beings themselves? What if the danger was, what would happen if we remembered who they really were? The idea may sound impossible, but history is full of erased truths. Entire civilizations have vanished beneath the sand, only to be rediscovered thousands of years later. Languages once called dead have been revived. Knowledge once labelled forbidden has returned stronger than before. And throughout all of this, one pattern never changes. The past always finds a way back, no matter how hard someone tries to bury it. The old gods may not walk the earth in human form, but traces of them remain in the stories we tell, in the symbols we draw, and in the dreams that visit us in the quiet hours of the night. As humanity enters a new age, something interesting is happening. People are beginning to question the old narrative. They are wondering why so many gods across different cultures share similar shapes and symbols. They are asking why the church needed to turn these gods into demons. They are studying ancient texts with open minds instead of fear. Every year, more discoveries challenge the idea that Christianity created the only truth. Ancient temples are uncovered. Old manuscripts are translated. Forgotten names return to the surface. And with each discovery, another thread of the old world is rewoven into history. So, what happens if the gods return? Maybe they never left. Maybe they live on through the energy of nature, through the cycles of the seasons, and through the memories carried in our bones. Maybe the return is not a physical arrival, but a mental awakening. A moment when humanity realizes that the world is wider, older, and stranger than the story we were given. If we stop fearing the beings labeled as demons, we might see them differently, as guardians of knowledge, as protectors of the earth, as ancient forces that once guided humanity toward wisdom instead of fear. The Church feared this possibility, which is why it works so hard to rewrite history. But memory is stronger than fear. And as people search for truth, one question grows louder. Who benefits when the past is hidden? If the old gods return in memory, in art, or in spirit, they may help us see the world with new eyes. Not as a battlefield between good and evil, but as a tapestry woven from countless cultures and countless beliefs. The return of the gods is not a warning. It is a reminder that the story is not over. It never was.